Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and hopefully you all can see that. Can you all see that? Okay, perfect. Again, I really appreciate being here, especially during a very busy and crazy time. I'm super excited to share this work with you, and this is actually co-authored with one of my fabulous grad students at Arizona, Peter Orr. And this is a topic that I have spent quite a bit of time thinking about, but in many ways, it's still very much a work in progress. And so what I'm really interested in hearing today is any thoughts or suggestions that you might have, particularly with respect to our analytic approach. As will become apparent as I go through the description of our data and methods, it's pretty clear that we face a couple of data constraints that limit what type of specifications can in fact be feasibly done. All right, so this talk is grounded in a larger project of mine that examines how local political factors, as well as the introduction of relatively new populations, are linked to fertility and fertility decision-making processes. This is sort of a two-part project, but for the sake of time for today, I'm only going to be talking about this first issue, which asks whether the US foreign population, specifically white and Black women, adjust their fertility in response to the foreign-born population. Sorry. I probably don't need to remind anyone here, but immigrants have dramatically reshaped the demographic landscape in the US. Some estimates by Pew Research suggest that there are an additional 72 million persons living in the US, and that this is attributable to immigration as well as the natural increase stemming from migration occurring after 1965. So this is a massive number of additional persons. And it's also true that if you look at this graph here, we see that the composition of country of origin immigrants has dramatically changed over time. So in the mid to late 1800s, the vast majority of immigrants came from Southern and Eastern Europe. The most contemporary wave, which again, post-1965, we could see that about 90% of immigrants have origins outside of Europe and North America. And so this suggests that they're very, very much visible in the racial landscape compared to earlier waves of immigrants. And so, in addition to immigrants changing the demographic landscape, both at the national and local level, it's also true that immigrants are bringing an assorted, new cultures, new practices, and belief systems when they enter the US. So this was true of prior waves of immigrants, but it's also true of contemporary immigrants today. And so there's been a growing amount of work that examines the arts and artistic contribution of immigrants, the contributions that they have made in terms of scientific and technology pursuits, how they have shifted language acquisition of US institutions and persons. In a recent paper that I've published with a grad student, we also find evidence that immigrants and their kids really influence local restaurant availability as well as restaurant ownership of non-co-ethnics. And so, all of this suggests that, there is to some extent a tolerance and a demand for these new cultural practices and contributions, and that, some US-born individuals or groups might even adopt the tastes and preferences that immigrants sort of bring with them. But what we're seeing as well, sort of at the same time, is there's this belief that immigration is increasingly posing a threat to the current racial and cultural order. And so, as immigrants are becoming a larger share of the population, and as immigrants are exerting more influence, we're also seeing the number of anti-immigrant sentiment and extremist groups increase as well. And so this headline was taken from the New York Times. I'm sure many of you remember this is the 2019 El Paso shooting, where approximately 22 people, all of whom were Hispanic, were killed by a domestic terrorist. And this domestic terrorist vocalized concerns about white extinction. And, this is not the only headline I could have selected that really shows how far-right groups, how, extremist individuals express anxiety about, declines in white fertility, as well as this idea of replacement. And it's worth mentioning that how these far-right groups think about replacement is different than how we as demographers think about replacement. So in this context, it's the idea that whites are being purposely and deliberately replaced by highly fertile minority and immigrant groups. All right. And I think what is especially significant, in my view, is that this discourse and these concerns aren't necessarily limited to the far right and to extremist groups. And if we look a little deeper, we can find similar sentiments in, mainstream internet platforms, as well as in, media sources that are geared towards a more academic audience. So this was a headline taken from The Conversation. It's a journalistic website geared, in fact, toward academics. And the piece examined many trends that we kind of care about, many things that people in this room have studied extensively, right? So it examines, for instance, where white mortality is increasing. It's examining and exploring where white fertility is decreasing and where minority groups are on the rise. And so the actual work and the argument were factually true, right? And the data were accurate, everything sort of checked out, but this headline and parts of the conclusion and the language peppered throughout, I would argue engages in some panicked language about demographic change that is linked to immigration. So what I'm arguing here is that there is this sort of tension around immigration and how it's changing US society, right? So on the one hand, immigrants are seen as bringing an array of cultural contributions, some, but not all of which are adopted and demanded by US-born populations. But on the other hand, we're also seeing that immigration is being seen as a threat to existing traditions and to the current racial hierarchy. And this sentiment, I argue, is becoming increasingly prominent outside of extremist groups. To be clear, there is quite a bit of work that examines the relationship between fertility and immigration, right? But the vast majority of this work focuses on how immigrants respond, i.e. assimilate to the US-born persons over time and across generations. And this work, even though it's highly influential, sort of implicitly, I would argue, assumes that the fertility decisions of US-born women are divorced from the foreign-born population. And when we think about this assumption paired with this pretty extensive and prominent work that argues how local cultural and social conditions impact childbearing across the world, I think this becomes a slightly more heroic assumption. So there is work at the individual level that examines the extent to which individual family members, siblings, friendship networks influence the probability that a woman will have a child or an additional child. And there's a wealth of information as well that examines how the exchange of norms, belief systems, and information can fundamentally change fertility within communities as well as across larger levels of geography. So what I'm going to do today, and what sort of I set out to do, is I'm going to assess this link between immigration, fertility, and the local context. And what I'm doing is going to propose two scenarios where immigration might plausibly be related to increases or increased fertility of US foreign populations. So the first is this process of relational assimilation. And the second is one of sort of this idea of maintaining ethnic boundaries. All right, so before I outline some of the details related to this first scenario, I want to first highlight a common misconception surrounding assimilation theory, and then I'm going to build on this. All right, so if you go back to the original texts of assimilation and Park and Burgess's work in 1921, it remains the most prominent. Assimilation was originally conceptualized as this fusion-like process, and I'll quickly go through this, where persons and groups acquire the memories, the sentiments, and attitudes of other persons or groups, and by sharing their experiences and history are incorporated with them in a common cultural life. And so what I think is really clear based on this text is that Park in particular was agnostic about the direction that assimilation would occur. It was not outlined necessarily that assimilation is this process of immigrants moving closer to US foreign persons. So for Park here, assimilation is just the decline of group difference. And this sentiment was actually carried out up until the 1950s, where scholars also bought into this argument where assimilation was this sort of two-directional process. It was noted, though, and Green did some work in like the 50s, where he argued that, yes, assimilation is likely to be multi-directional, but the effects will be asymmetric. So given existing power structures and the organization of US society, the host society should exhibit less movement toward immigrant culture than immigrants are moving. So there is this acknowledgement, again, that assimilation was in fact this two-way process. And what we're going to do here is we're going to build on this idea of assimilation being a two-way process to sort of situate fertility in this multi-directional assimilation scenario. So typically, on average, we see that foreign-born women typically have larger families upon arrival to the US. And this can stem from, a variety of factors, right? This might be related to cultural differences like preferences surrounding familism. This could also be due to the differences in the access and availability to reliable contraception. But what we're arguing is that, as these immigrants arrive to the U.S. with with larger families, these norms and belief systems should be retained as these immigrants settle in the U.S. and, work and go to school and are engaged in local communities. And so what we're basically suggesting here is that these norms are likely to diffuse into communities, into workplaces, even as immigrants are assimilating themselves. And so here is sort of the big argument here. So if immigrants regularly encounter the US foreign population in communities, in school, and in the workplace, we should see that this intergroup exposure is going to weaken ethnic differences, and that this should ultimately result in this process of relational assimilation. And for Jimenez, this relational assimilation refers to the fact that immigrants are going to transform the host society to more closely resemble immigrant groups. And this process of relational assimilation has been documented in things like language ability. It's been documented in terms of food, the sciences as well. And we're arguing that this presumably could also be extended to local childbearing patterns as well, and how these norms and preferences get diffused between immigrants and the US born. So here is just a very basic informal model about how we're thinking about relational assimilation. So, we're thinking about this process of intergroup exposure as a potential mediator of the relationship between the immigrant population, say at time T, and subsequent fertility of US-born persons. And so in this first scenario, we should observe a positive relationship between the immigrant population and the fertility of US-born persons, but that this relation should weaken with the presence or inclusion of a measure of intergroup exposure. And here CT just denotes our set of likely confounders. All right, so this is not the only way, though, that immigrants may in fact influence the fertility of US-born persons. It could also be the case, though, that increases in fertility may be a way or a strategy to actually maintain or reinforce existing group boundaries. So, if we start with the idea of pronatalism, this is considered a political, a religious tool, or an ideology that encourages fertility amongst certain ethnic and national groups. And prior work does show that national power and influence, including specific traditions and practices, is intimately tied with demographic composition. And so when nations experience shrinking native populations and heightened immigration, it's often the case that political leaders, academics, and institutions will engage in pro-natal rhetoric. And sometimes this rhetoric is translated into policies that implicitly or explicitly attempt to maintain the current racial order. It's often the case that pronatalism is directed towards groups, majority groups who are seen as ethnically or socially superior. And it's certainly, if we think about all of this operating in unison, it is certainly the case that women and their childbearing decisions and ultimate behaviors play a pretty central role in these nationalistic projects. And these sentiments are perhaps most obviously identified in white power and white nationalist organizations, like the KKK, like skinheads and neo-Nazis, for example. Certainly not limited to, but these are some of the more commonly known organizations. And within these movements, I think it's worth highlighting a couple of things. First, women are responsible by and large for the day-to-day operations within these units. So oftentimes, women are responsible for helping to organize marches. They are answering emails, networking across different chapters within states to boost membership. And perhaps most importantly, though, women are seen as playing a primary role in socializing children into these white nationalist movements. And, as sort of symbols, though, women are also sort of idealized as helping to reproduce the white race. And this excellent book, Catherine Below actually followed a number of individuals in these white nationalist organizations And they continually report that the birth of white children is a deliberate act of war against impending minority and immigrant threats. And it's certainly true, though, that concerns about white genocide and, again, replacement, how they're thinking about replacement, are also expressed outside of the far right. And so from a historic perspective, Lovett examines pronatalism and the eugenics movement in the early 20th century. And she finds that academics, so including the once president at Stanford, as well as Teddy Roosevelt, really viewed childbearing as white women's responsibility to the state. And they saw this as being an incredibly important process, let's call it, given the amount of heightened immigration that was coming into urban areas from Eastern and Southern Europe. And I think one of the other important things to note here is that pronatalism isn't always very explicit. So it's not always eugenics. It's not always rooted necessarily in white power and white nationalist movements. We can also think about softer efforts to boost fertility. And so Lovett argues, if we go back and trace the suburbanization of the US, if we go back and trace the promotion, the nationwide promotion of Mother's Day as a national holiday, the process of tracing discounted meals to school-aged children, all of these were deliberate efforts at trying to boost the fertility of white women, especially those outside of urban areas. And so the last thing that I want to talk about here is that we can also think about pronatalism as being an existing beyond sort of white supremacy, if you will, and white power organizations. And one way we can think about this is by examining Black nationalist groups. And so, quite understandably, after years of experiencing forced sterilization and state-sanctioned violence, some advocates of the Black power movement really were critical against things like birth control and against reducing family size. So, for instance, the Black Panthers were really concerned that the state would try to completely eliminate the Black population. The Black Muslims also had and shared similar sentiments, but also really emphasized women's role within the movement to sort of reproduce the population. And so we want to be really clear here that we're not treating Black nationalist and white supremacist groups similarly. In fact, one can be traced to, is the result of white supremacy. And it's also true that these Black nationalist groups aren't embedded in policies and institutions in the ways that these white groups are. All right. So here is just a really second basic conceptual model. And here we're treating the immigrant population as a potential moderator between anti-immigrant sentiment and US fertility. So, given this link between nationalism and fertility that we see historically and some evidence of the current day, we're expecting to see this positive relationship here between anti-immigrant sentiment and fertility. And that this relation, this positive relation, should be magnified in areas with a larger share of the immigrant population. And we think that this is likely to be the case because it's these areas where majority culture is just perceived to be the most threatened. All right. So we explore, this is a county level analysis, and we pull data from a variety of different sources. I'm not going to describe all of these today, but I'm happy to answer any questions about them during the Q&A. So our outcome is going to be the county total fertility rate, which we separately calculate for non-Hispanic US-born white and Black women in the 2010-2014 period. There's a couple of things to note here that are pretty important about the construction of this measure. So our numerator, or births, when we identify births to US-born non-Hispanic white and Black women, we rely on birth records from vital statistics, and we capture births in counties where women actually reside. Our denominator, though, these age and race origin-specific estimates come from the American Community Survey, the 5-year estimates. And so to make these a little more comparable, what we do is we average births between 2010 and 14 just to make it a little more comparable when constructing this TFR. So to rely on the immigrant population, there's a couple of different approaches we could have taken. We just rely on the percent foreign born during the 2005 and 9 period. So this again comes from the ACS, and we use the 2005-9 period to allow women enough time to potentially respond to their local environment, and also to account for that approximate 9-month gestation period. It's worth noting, and I'm happy to talk about this later, but we were curious what would happen if we examined, the percent foreign born with origins in Latin America, and results are in fact substantively similar. But we have a couple of reasons for just drawing on the foreign born population. All right, so we have a total of 3 measures of anti-immigrant sentiment or xenophobia. First, we draw on measures from the Southern Poverty Law Center in the 2005-9 period to get a count or an indicator of the presence of hate groups. And so we ultimately include several organizations to represent white power organizations, and we also include and identify organizations that are considered Black nationalists by the Southern Poverty Law Center. So we're ultimately left with creating a dichotomous measure of whether there is a presence of either one of these organizations in a given county. And I think it's safe to say that, this particular measure is, sort of represents this very overt measure of racist nationalism. Our second measure of anti-immigrant sentiment actually comes from Google Trends. And again, it's collected during the same time period. But what we do is we essentially identify specific search terms, and I've listed them here, that are likely going to echo some degree of xenophobia or anti-immigrant sentiment. And so each search term, each of these keywords comes attached to a numerical value for a given geographic area provided by Google. So for instance, the term illegal immigrant comes with a score that ranges between 0 and 100. And this is a relative score, meaning we can think about it as being relative to all other searches conducted in this area. How frequently is illegal immigrant searched for in this area? And so higher values indicate more popular searches. And because these 7 phrases are fairly similar, what we do is we just average these scores across all terms to create this overall measure of like xenophobia. And because this is private search data, essentially, we think about this more in terms of a latent measure of anti-immigrant sentiment that isn't as pronounced as that hate group. All right, Finally, what we do is we also rely on the percent of Republican votes cast during the 2004 and 2008 presidential election. It's also, again, worth noting that results aren't sensitive to this averaging. So if we only use 2008 data, results are substantively similar. I think this is probably one of our more controversial measures, but there is quite a bit of work that argues that there's a strong link between xenophobia and support for conservative candidates throughout the US and Europe. And it's also true that having high degrees of anti-immigrant sentiment was the single strongest predictor of voting for Republican in the past election. And so we're thinking about this data as capturing something, again, perhaps a little softer efforts geared towards pronatalism. All right, so there are a variety of ways, right? So I've talked about the measures we're relying on to examine xenophobia, anti-immigrant sentiment. Now I'm turning attention to how we're thinking about relational assimilation. And ideally, we would have an indicator that really represents the US-born population fully immersed or engaged in immigrant life. So we want some indicator that perhaps a boundary is in fact weak. And there were quite a bit of ways that we can proceed, but we are, for the time being, relying on the percent of US-born whites and Blacks who speak another language. And we are drawing on the 2005 and 2009 ACS to do this. And I'm going to come back to this point, actually, very, very shortly. All right, so we control for a variety of likely confounders. I'm not going to talk about all of them, but this includes local county level socioeconomic measures, demographics, various region indicators, and perhaps most importantly, we're also going to be controlling for prior fertility in this 2005 and 2009 period. And again, this is going to be specified as the total fertility rate. We're also going to control for the number of congregations in a given county, as well as the number of Planned Parenthood and public health clinics in a given area. Now, before I go on to describe our analytic approach and specification strategy, I want to briefly touch on some of the data constraints that we face when carrying out this work. So first, it's really difficult to capture meaningful changes in anti-immigrant sentiment before the year 2000. So the Southern Poverty Law Center doesn't start reliably collecting information on hate groups until 2000, 2001. And perhaps even more importantly, not everyone had access, reliable and regular access to the internet before 2004. And for this reason, the Google Trend data is only available beginning in 2004. So we're forced to sort of start our specifications at this point. The other thing is, ideally, fertility is going to be measured after these key predictors to allow some lag between what the local context is looking like and subsequent fertility decisions. All right. The other issue and sort of constraint that we're facing is the construction of our total fertility rate. So remember, our denominators are obtained from the American Community Survey 5-year estimates. And this was a decision we made so that all counties could be included in this analysis. We could certainly rely on 3-year or 1-year estimates, but we would then be limiting our scope and analyses to areas that contain more than, I think it's 20,000 residents. So there's a couple of different things that are going on that really constrain the time period that we're able to look at. The other thing I want to briefly mention is sort of the expected magnitude of these estimates. So I alluded to this earlier when we talked about the asymmetrical nature of assimilation, but Gordon has done quite a bit of work thinking about what the likely impact and contribution of immigrants are likely to be, as well as some recent work by Alba. And the consensus, it's a small consensus, but the consensus is that the effects that immigrants have should be fairly weak. So we're in an ideal world, we shouldn't see anything, our estimates shouldn't be completely large. That would be a signal that there's likely something going on. All right, so with that, what we do is we primarily rely on a series just of basic lagged outcome specifications to look at the relationship between fertility, immigration, and these two scenarios of interest. So what we do here in our test of moderation is we use fertility in the 2005 and 9 period, our 3 measures of xenophobia, and our series of covariates to predict fertility in the 2010-14 period. And then to really assess this moderation piece, we go ahead and include an indicator for the percent foreign born and our associated interaction terms with the foreign born and each measure of anti-immigrant sentiment. It's worth noting, and I'll probably come back to this point, but if we separately enter and estimate each measure of xenophobia, results are substantively similar. So this doesn't really seem sensitive to that. All right. Oops. So in order to examine this idea of relational assimilation, we use a series of really basic mediation model progressions as documented and suggested by McKinnon and colleagues. And so all we're doing is testing whether this measure of relational we're testing whether our measure of relational assimilation, meaning the share of US-born whites and Blacks who speak another language, is going to mediate this relationship between the foreign-born population and white and Black fertility. Right, so what we do is we separately estimate the specifications for US-born non-Hispanic whites and Blacks. I'm happy to talk about this decision later, but we ultimately dropped counties in Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and Alaska. And we're also limiting our analyses to counties where at least 20 births took place. And so we do a fairly good job at retaining areas in counties for non-Hispanic whites, but we lose quite a bit when we conduct our analysis for Black women. And that's because of just a lack of sufficient Black populations in certain counties and also births. All right, so I'm just showing you a couple of key descriptives here. We see that the non-Hispanic US Black total fertility rate is slightly above replacement level at almost 2.2. We have our non-Hispanic white TFR at about 1.95. About 21% of counties have a designated white hate group. Only 4% of counties have a Black nationalist group. And we could see that, with respect to Google searches and trends, remember this ranges between 0 and 100. So there's not an abundance, I would say, of searching for like anti-immigrant terms. I want to draw your attention, though, to these two figures. And this represents the share of whites and Blacks who speak a non-English language. So this is actually pretty small. We only have about 2.5% of whites and 4% of Blacks who speak a non-English language. And this is a point that I'm going to come back to in the discussion. All right, so what I'm going to do is go through results for white women first, and then for Black women. So I'm showing results for our test of moderation, or this first hypothesis first. This first model here just contains our 3 measures of anti-immigrant sentiment and no control variables. We then, in model 2, add a series of controls as well as the percent foreign born. And in our final, what we're calling model 3, is we include all associated interaction terms here. And as I mentioned, these really don't seem particularly sensitive to estimating each of these hate groups one at a time. So I'm going to show you a couple of figures just so you're not staring at this table. All right. So here are predicted white fertility rates in the 2010-14 period by the percent foreign born and the presence, which is denoted by this red line, and the absence denoted by this blue line of white supremacist organizations. And so we see that in locations without any white supremacist organizations, fertility is actually predicted to be lower in counties with a pretty large immigrant population. We see also this negative relationship. But in areas where there is in fact a white supremacist group, there is a trivial amount of evidence, I would say, that fertility might increase as the percent foreign born increases. And if we look in densely populated immigrant areas, fertility is indeed higher in these locations where hate groups are present. So what I'm going to go through now, okay. Are just our share of, here are our, I've developed just some contour plots to look at the interactions between percent foreign born and Republican votes. And predicted fertility is shown, different predicted values of fertility is shown by each of these shaded lines. And so just really quickly, fertility is highest in areas with few voters and few foreign-born persons. Fertility is much lower in areas with large numbers of foreign-born populations and few Republican votes. But as we move our eyes from the left to the right-hand side, there's actually evidence that fertility converges. And so it's going to decrease. We see it getting lighter in areas with few foreign-born persons and a large number of voters. Fertility, though, increases as we move from very few to a large share of voters in immigrant-dense populations. So this finding is pretty similar to what we observed with our hate group data. Results for Google Trends are a little different. In fact, they're sort of patterned in the opposite way. So we're not seeing a ton of variation here in predicted fertility. And it's only when our Google score enters pretty high values that fertility is predicted to be pretty large or relatively large. But it's not patterned by foreign-born really whatsoever. All right, so with Black total fertility rate, I'm just going to go through, I'm just going to end here because we find essentially no evidence that Black fertility is predicted by measures of Black nationalism, Google Trends, or share of Republican voters. So our main effects here are not significantly different from zero. These interaction terms are not precisely estimated. So there's quite a bit of indication that Black and white fertility are not operating in the same way. And this isn't necessarily surprising, let's say. We find no evidence of relational assimilation whatsoever. I suspect this is probably because we don't have sufficient variation in our measure of language use to really leverage. We did look at a series preliminary analyses of first differencing specifications, and we have to make a little bit of different assumptions with respect to the lag time, but results, they're smaller, they're more imprecise for our moderation analyses, but overall they're similar. We're considering, the possibility of thinking about a potential instrument, but I'm sort of stuck in terms of thinking about using a convincing instrument for measures of xenophobia. I'm happy to talk about that later. Okay, so what do we find? There's some evidence of boundary making for white fertility. So overall, what we do see is fertility tends to be highest in counties with few immigrants. But in immigrant-dense counties, fertility is comparably high when xenophobia is heightened and when it is present. So there's some evidence, but not a whole lot here. And we only find these patterns, it's worth reiterating, for Republican votes and hate groups. And let's see, I want to just quickly think about how we're proceeding with the interpretation of our results thus far. And so one of the things we're thinking about is the extent to which actual local immigration flows matter, that this story about nationalism and anti-immigrant sentiment might be more reflective about perceptions and concerns about a perceived racial and ethnic threat rather than reality. And so this is something that we're just sort of thinking about and keeping in mind. And we're also thinking about, who is most likely to be vocal about boosting fertility. And if you look at the sort of message boards, the discourse that exists, it's often men who are most vocal. And so there could be a mismatch between what men prefer in these movements versus women who have to assume the vast majority of this work. So again, we are sort of in the midst of this project. It had a lot of starts and stops, but I think sort of the big contribution of what we're trying to do is build this theory of intergroup relations and how immigration is patterned with things like nationalism and fertility. Do I have time for one more slide, Jim?
Yeah, if you do it quickly, that'll give us about 10 minutes or so for questions.
Yeah. So I just want to briefly show this slide from the Population Reference Bureau. And it just shows and states a very simple demographic trend, right? And I think, for instance, it's certainly true, right, that the fertility of Hispanic women is higher than those of white women, for instance, right? And there's certainly nothing wrong with demographers and social scientists sharing these facts. I think it's absolutely necessary. But I think as demographers and as academics, we need to be cognizant of how our work is sometimes weaponized by the far right and by political leaders, including many state senators, for their own political purposes. So I just think we need to also just think about how our work is used more broadly. All right, that's it. Thanks.